You are walking quietly through the narrow, cobblestone streets of 19th century London. The gas lamps flicker dimly against a hazy curtain of fog. The sound of carriage wheels blends with the faint cries of a newsboy calling out the day's headlines. Stories of empire, of progress, of pain. Beneath it all, there's another hum quieter, almost invisible. A hum of sleep, of relief, of escape. Bottled neatly in dark glass vials, sealed with cork, and sold over every counter in the city. That hum was laudanum, the medicine that soothed the nerves of a restless age. Laudanum was, in its simplest form, a mixture of opium and alcohol, typically around 10% opium by volume, dissolved in strong wine or brandy. It was cheap, legal, and astonishingly easy to obtain. By the mid-1800s you could buy it from an apothecary, a grocer, or even by mail order. It was the most popular medicine in Britain, used by everyone from farmers to poets, from seamstresses to duchesses. The Victorians called it God's own medicine. It cured everything. At least, that's what they believed. A drop for toothache, a spoonful for sleeplessness, a dose for melancholy, and for babies who wouldn't stop crying, a few drops in warm milk. The name laudanum came from Paracelsus, a Renaissance physician who mixed early forms of opium tincture and praised it as a divine remedy. By the time of Queen Victoria, the formula had been refined, standardized, and mass-produced. Apothecaries sold it under hundreds of names: tincture of opium, Batley's sedative solution, Mother Bailey's quieting syrup. All of them, in truth, were the same: dark, bitter, and powerfully narcotic. In an age before antibiotics, before anesthesia, before modern pain relief, laudanum seemed miraculous. It dulled physical pain, quieted anxious thoughts, and softened the sharp edges of a world spinning faster each year. The Industrial Revolution had brought new machines, new wealth, new expectations. But it had also brought exhaustion. Imagine a typical Victorian household: coal dust drifting through the curtains, the ticking of a clock in a quiet parlor. A woman sits by the fire, her corset tight, her hands trembling slightly. She has been coughing for weeks. Her husband works long hours and the children are noisy and demanding. On the mantel sits a bottle of laudanum. It promises, in its tiny handwritten label, peaceful rest and relief. She pours a teaspoon into a glass of water, swirls it slowly, and drinks. The bitterness spreads through her chest. A cold, warm wave follows. The house softens around her. The ticking slows. For a few precious hours she is still. This was not the image of vice. It was the image of respectability. In Victorian Britain, drug use was not hidden in alleys. It was a part of polite society. Doctors prescribed laudanum to writers, clergymen, factory workers, and children alike. Women, especially, were encouraged to take it for the vague but common ailments of female hysteria, nervousness, and delicate constitutions. Among the middle and upper classes, laudanum use became almost a quiet ritual. A teaspoon before bed, a few drops in the morning tea, for menstrual pain, childbirth, recovery, or the endless waves of anxiety that came from living in a world of strict manners and constant judgment. But behind this polite consumption lay an invisible web of dependence. By the 1840s, addiction, though not yet called by that name, was everywhere. People began to notice that they could not sleep without it. That pain returned sharper when the bottle ran empty. That dreams became strange and nights long when they tried to stop. Writers like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Thomas de Quincey had already described the seductive pull of opium. In his famous Confessions of an English Opium Eater's 1821, de Quincey told the story of his own descent, beginning with laudanum to ease stomach pain, and ending with nightly doses large enough to fell a horse. Yet even his confessions had a certain romance. He wrote of floating cities, of dreams like silk. The Victorian mind, both fascinated and afraid, saw laudanum as something between sin and salvation. Doctors, meanwhile, struggled to understand what they were witnessing. Addiction was not yet a recognized illness. It was seen as moral weakness. And yet, how could one accuse the wary mother, or the poet, or the priest who merely followed medical advice? In parlors and pharmacies, the debate went unspoken. Laudanum was a private medicine, taken in solitude, its effects hidden behind lace curtains and polite conversation. It was both everywhere and invisible. By the mid-19th century, laudanum consumption reached astonishing levels. In England alone, estimates suggest that 1 in 10 adults used it regularly. In the poorer districts of cities like Manchester or Liverpool, it was cheaper than beer, and for some it was the only escape from a grim and grinding life. In wealthier homes, the bottles were finer, crystal instead of glass, but the dependency was the same. Some households kept a bottle in every room. Servants dosed their mistresses. Chemists refilled prescriptions without question. and when symptoms worsened, the advice was simple: take more. In 1868, the Pharmacy Act finally placed mild restrictions on opium sales, but it changed little. The law did not ban laudanum, it merely required that it be sold by licensed chemists. Even then, the label still read poison, but it might as well have said comfort. The story of laudanum is not a story of criminals or outcasts. It is a story of ordinary people, trying to manage pain in a world that offered few other remedies. It is, in a quiet way, the story of a society that dosed itself to sleep. There was a strange contradiction in it all. The same empire that prided itself on discipline and moral virtue was also built on a trade in narcotics. British ships carried opium from India to China, fueling the infamous opium wars of the 1840s and 1850s. Wars fought not to stop addiction, but to preserve Britain's right to sell it. At home, the product returned in polished form, sweetened and diluted, wrapped in the language of medicine. Abroad, it destroyed nations. Inside the domestic heart of the empire, drawing rooms and nursery rooms alike, laudanum became an intimate companion. For women especially, whose emotional lives were often constrained and dismissed, it provided a kind of quiet rebellion, a secret softness in a hard world. The diaries of the era tell us little, but the silences between lines tell us much. Entries like "slept well tonight" or "felt calmer after tea" were small codes, perhaps, for doses taken. The hands that wrote them trembled less afterward. Laudanum's effects were, at first, gentle, warmth, drowsiness, a lessening of pain. But the body remembered. Tolerance grew. The same teaspoon that once calmed now barely soothed. Many women increased their dose gradually, unknowingly binding themselves to a chemical that would reshape their lives. Addiction came slowly, like dusk creeping across a parlor floor, first in mood, then in memory, then in body. A missed dose might bring restlessness, sweat, nausea. But to the Victorians, this too seemed merely another illness, something to be cured, perhaps, with more medicine. Even the great reformers and thinkers of the time were not untouched. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, one of the most celebrated poets of her age, took laudanum for much of her adult life to manage chronic pain. Her poetry, though luminous, carries undercurrents of melancholy and longing that mirror the drug's strange embrace. Some historians believe that even Queen Victoria herself used opiates after childbirth, though in her case, it was administered by doctors as chloroform and morphine rather than laudanum. Still, the line between medical and habitual use was thin. As you listen, imagine the countless small moments, bottles clinking softly in nightstands, teaspoons dipped and stirred, the bitter taste masked by sugar or tea, the glow of a lamp beside a wary face. A nation lulled, not by propaganda or politics, but by chemistry, and yet beneath the surface calm. Questions lingered. How many of these quiet lives were quietly unraveling? How many women found that their peace had turned to dependence, their gentle elixir, a silent captor? As the century moved forward, science would begin to pull back the curtain. Doctors would start to measure doses, to document withdrawal, to question the morality of prescribing pleasure as medicine. But in these early decades, the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, the empire slept soundly under the watch of its favorite drug, and as the bottles emptied and refilled, one could almost hear the collective sigh of a civilization medicating its anxieties away. When we look back now, we see the patterns clearly, the beginnings of the modern drug epidemic, the slow entanglement of medicine and commerce, the quiet suffering hidden beneath manners and lace. But to those living through it, laudanum was simply life, a necessary relief, a friend in the night, a sweet, bitter companion to the age of steam. And so the question remains, in a world that prized propriety above all else, how long could such a secret truly remain hidden? You can almost hear the soft clink of porcelain as tea is poured into fine china cups. The scent of bergamot drifts faintly through the parlor, mingling with the subtle sharpness of coal smoke. A few streets away, carriage wheels roll over cobblestone, their rhythm steady and patient. It is late afternoon in London, around 1865, and in drawing rooms across the city, society women are gathering, for tea, for conversation, for the maintenance of appearance. The air is polite, restrained, and practiced. Laughter is soft. Posture is perfect. No one mentions the small bottles tucked discreetly in handbags or hidden in the folds of a desk drawer. Yet nearly every woman in this room, from the blushing debutante to the widowed matron, has at one time or another taken laudanum, not as a vice, not as a sin, but as medicine. To understand Victorian society is to understand its expectations, particularly for women. They were to be calm, graceful, and endlessly composed. The household was their kingdom, and within it their conduct reflected directly on the family's moral standing. To feel anxious, depressed, or overwhelmed was seen not as human, but as unseemly. And so, the chemist's shop became a quiet refuge. A woman might enter under the pretense of buying cough syrup or tonic water. Behind the counter, the chemist, always discreet, would measure out a dark amber liquid into a small at night. He might whisper, as if confiding a secret, or more, if you find your sleep restless. The same chemist might have served her mother, and her grandmother before her. Laudanum had become part of the domestic inheritance, passed down through generations as a remedy for all that could not be spoken aloud. The domestic prescription for most Victorian women, illness was both physical and social. Their lives were defined by limited mobility and strict etiquette. Chronic fatigue, headaches, fainting spells, nervous hysteria, and female complaints were the vague diagnoses of the age, all of which could conveniently be treated by a few drops of opium tincture. Doctors wrote prescriptions freely, often without fully understanding the consequences. Laudanum was listed in medical compendiums for nearly every ailment: fever, diarrhea, insomnia, menstrual pain, melancholy, even the heartbreak of bereavement. It was, in short, the panacea of the polite world. A woman in mourning might take it to dull grief. A new mother might use it to calm her nerves after a sleepless night. A lonely wife might sip it in secret, long after her husband had retired to bed. It was not the loud vice of gin or tobacco. It was quiet, respectable, and utterly pervasive. Some brands even marketed specifically to mothers. Winslow's soothing syrup promised relief for teething infants. But its key ingredients were morphine and alcohol. Few realized that a single teaspoon could sedate a baby into dangerous stillness. The deaths that followed were rarely recorded as poisonings. They were simply called crib deaths. Another tragedy of fragile Victorian childhood. The line between healing and harm blurred easily when the same medicine could both soothe and destroy. In the shadows of comfort as the years passed, the culture of quiet dosing deepened. The use of laudanum spread from London to rural England, to Scotland, to Ireland. In isolated villages, the chemist's shop was often the only source of relief for miles. Laudanum became part of the weekly household budget, purchased alongside bread, candles, and tea. Records from small towns like Carlisle and York show astonishing figures. Some pharmacies sold hundreds of gallons a year. Even poor labourers, who could barely afford meat, kept a small bottle for, when the pains came on, it dulled hunger, eased exhaustion, and gave brief escape from the harshness of daily life. But in the parlors of the wealthy, it took on a different meaning. There, laudanum was part of the ritual of refinement. A spoonful stirred into wine before an evening of social calls. A small dose after dinner to settle the nerves. Women shared recipes for sleeping cordials that included opium, nutmeg, and honey. The addiction was not just physical, it was cultural. Victorian society prized restraint and control, yet laudanum offered a paradoxical form of freedom. It allowed one to surrender inwardly while maintaining outward composure. It was, in many ways, the perfect drug for a civilization obsessed with appearances. The writers and the dreamers as laudanum wove itself into everyday life. It also found a home in the minds of artists and intellectuals. Thomas de Quincey had already chronicled its allure in Confessions of an English Opium Eater, describing both the bliss and the horror of addiction. His words inspired fascination rather than fear, even admiration. To dream under the influence of laudanum seemed almost poetic. Soon after, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the Romantic poet, used it to soothe his chronic pain and anxiety. His visionary poem Kubla Khan, he claimed, was born from an opium dream interrupted by a visitor's knock. The result, half dream, half waking, captured the essence of the drug's strange power, beauty laced with incompletion. Other writers followed. Wilkie Collins, author of The Woman in White, used laudanum daily for gout, often writing entire novels under its haze. In his later years, he confessed to taking enough each day to kill a small family. The drug became almost an emblem of artistic sensitivity, a mark of the creative temperament. Yet behind the myth of the inspired dreamer lay the same slow decay that afflicted housewives and labourers alike. Dependence, insomnia, shaking hands, the endless cycle of relief and return, the hidden epidemic. By the 1870s, Britain was beginning to realise that something had gone terribly wrong. Newspapers printed quiet reports of opium habitus, a new term for those who could not go without their daily dose. Doctors wrote to medical journals, puzzled by patients who seemed incurable, complaining of vague ailments that only laudanum could soothe. The statistics were staggering. One estimate suggested that as much as half of all medical prescriptions in England contained opium in some form. Yet the moral panic that surrounded alcohol or prostitution never extended to laudanum. It remained a clean addiction, hidden beneath layers of lace and respectability. Women were particularly vulnerable. Physicians often dismissed their complaints as emotional weakness, treating psychological suffering with narcotic comfort. One doctor, in an 1878 issue of The Lancet, dryly, "The ladies of England are quietly poisoning themselves." But to challenge the drug's place in society was to question the entire medical establishment and the quiet dependencies of the middle and upper classes. And so, reform came slowly. The chemist's dilemma. The chemists themselves stood at the uneasy center of this quiet epidemic. They were respected figures in their communities, trusted to dispense medicine and advice. Yet they were also businessmen. Laudanum was profitable. A single gallon of opium tincture could be diluted into hundreds of doses and sold at a steady markup. There were no advertising bans, no medical oversight, and very little public awareness of its dangers. Some chemists, especially in poorer towns, sold stronger mixtures to those who demanded them. Others quietly kept ledgers of frequent buyers, lists of names that revealed how common dependence had become. Occasionally, an overdose made local headlines. A farmer's wife found cold in her bed. A clerk discovered at his desk the telltale bottle beside him. But these stories were exceptions. Most overdoses were simply mistaken for illnesses of the heart or lungs. Death certificates were vague, decorous, and final. The chemists continued their trade, the patients continued their dosing, and the empire continued to sleep. The gentle decline. By the late 19th century, science began to catch up with habit. Morphine, a purified form of opium, had been isolated in 1804, but it wasn't until the invention of the hypodermic syringe in the 1850s that it gained new popularity. Laudanum, with its unpredictable strength and bitter taste, began to seem old-fashioned. Doctors turned instead to morphine injections, believing them to be safer and more scientific. Ironically, this only deepened the problem. Morphine addiction spread rapidly, especially among doctors and patients who believed they were escaping the perils of laudanum. The cycle repeated itself, only more efficiently. In the 1890s, a new German company named Bayer introduced another supposed miracle cure, heroin, marketed as a non-addictive alternative to morphine. History, of course, would prove otherwise, but even as the 19th century waned, laudanum did not disappear. Its shadow lingered in every household that still kept a dusty bottle for emergencies, and in every memory of quiet, opiate rest. The women who slept through history. For the women of Victorian Britain, laudanum was more than a medicine. It was a means of survival. The world expected them to bear the burdens of family, childbirth, and social duty with grace and silence. Laudanum gave them silence, but at a terrible cost. In private letters and diaries, a pattern emerges: brief mentions of drops for sleep, of the medicine, of feeling calmer. Behind those coded phrases lies the story of emotional exhaustion, of trapped lives and small rebellions. Historians now see laudanum not merely as a drug, but as a window into the psychology of an entire society. A society that medicated its discomfort rather than confronting it. Each bottle of tincture was both a cure and a confession that something in the heart of Victorian life was unbearable. The rigidity of class, the suppression of feeling, the endless demand for decorum, all softened for a time by a few amber drops. And as those drops dissolved into tea, the line between endurance and escape blurred until they were one and the same. As night fell over the cities and the countryside alike, lamps dimmed, curtains were drawn, and England drifted into another laudanum dream. The hum of gaslights, the ticking of clocks, the slow fading of thought. A whole civilization gently sedated, yet questions remained, whispered in the quiet hours between sleep and waking. What would happen when the bottle ran dry? When the illusion of calm finally cracked? The world was changing. New sciences, new medicines, new movements for women's rights and labor reform were rising. Could a society so dependent on its secret elixir ever truly awaken? You wake again in that same London morning fog. Though now, the century is beginning to turn. The gas lamps still flicker, the cobblestones still glisten with the damp, but there's something different in the air. A faint unease. The rhythm of the age, once steady and composed, is shifting. Industry has remade the world, the railways have shrunk the map, and medicine, that quiet companion of Victorian life, is being forced to confront its own illusions. Laudanum, the comfort of so many lives, is beginning to show its cracks. The chemist's dilemma deepens. By the early 1890s, chemists across Britain could no longer ignore the whispers. Customers who had once come in monthly now came in weekly, even daily, asking for refills. Their hands shook slightly when they signed their names. Some carried folded prescriptions so worn that the ink had nearly vanished. Others brought none at all, merely nodding toward the shelf where the familiar bottles stood. There was still no true legal barrier to their sale, but a quiet discomfort had entered the trade. A chemist might refuse just once, only to see the customer's expression twist in quiet panic. Some begged. Some threatened to report him for cruelty. Others found another shop. The Pharmacy Act of 1868, meant to curb misuse, had done little to change public behavior. Opium tinctures remained available, labeled poison, yes, but still placed beside patent tonics and perfumes. And in those patent remedies lay another trap. Manufacturers, knowing full well the addictive comfort of opium, continued to lace everyday products with it: cough syrups, sleep drops, digestive elixirs, even tonic biscuits. The exact ingredients were often concealed under vague descriptions: herbal restoratives, or oriental essence. It was not unusual for a household to consume opiates daily without ever realizing it. Yet the human toll was slowly becoming harder to ignore. The women who could not wake in parlors and bedrooms across the country. The signs appeared first among women, the very population that had embraced laudanum most completely: pale faces, trembling hands, persistent coughs that never healed, sleeplessness that no longer responded to the medicine that once ensured it. Doctors began to recognize a pattern they could not name, an illness that seemed to arise from the cure itself. They called it the opium habit. Women wrote privately of their struggles in diaries, often with guilt rather than defiance. One entry, found decades later among the papers of a minor Lancashire noblewoman, reads simply, "I have tried to stop, I cannot. I am so very tired. I think I would rather sleep forever." She was not alone. Across class lines the same quiet despair spread, though always hidden behind propriety. Few confessed openly. To admit dependence was to risk scandal, or at least the disapproval of one's peers. Instead, they carried on dosing smaller and smaller amounts, hoping to wean themselves, but withdrawal was cruel. Headaches, cold sweats, shaking limbs, nightmares that clawed at the edges of sanity, and through it all the terrible longing for relief. Some endured and survived, many did not. Medicine faces itself as the new century approached. A younger generation of doctors began to ask questions that their mentors had avoided. Why did some patients seem to crave the medicine itself? Why did doses rise even when symptoms improved? In 1879, the British Medical Journal published one of the first papers to use the term addiction in relation to opium. The author described it as disease of habit, in which the drug becomes necessary to the continuance of existence. It was a radical thought, that dependency might be physical, not merely moral. This was the beginning of a slow and painful awakening. Doctors realized that many of their own colleagues were afflicted. Morphine, which had replaced laudanum in much of the medical profession, was even more potent and even harder to abandon. The very men lecturing against opium often carried syringes in their pockets. Meanwhile, social reformers began to take note of the broader pattern. They saw not just individual suffering, but a society lulled into complacency, an empire that had built its wealth on the opium trade, exporting addiction abroad while consuming it quietly at home. The irony was not lost on them. From drawing rooms to debates, public debate began to stir. Newspapers that had once advertised opium tonics now published editorials condemning them. The language shifted, from reverence to concern, from remedy to danger. One of the most vocal campaigners was Dr. Norman Kerr, a Scottish physician who founded the Society for the Study and Cure of Inebriety in 1884. He argued that habitual use of laudanum and morphine should be seen not as vice, but as illness, a revolutionary claim for its time. His writings described patients whose lives had quietly disintegrated beneath respectability: clergymen, housewives, businessmen, even doctors. He called addiction the disease of self-deception, and he meant it in every sense. But even as reformers raised their voices, many resisted change. Laudanum had been a fixture of British life for over 2 centuries. To take it away felt, to some, like tearing away a part of domestic comfort itself. And so the reformers focused on awareness, publishing pamphlets, hosting lectures, urging the government to tighten laws. The Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920 would eventually criminalize the unrestricted sale of opium, but by then laudanum's golden age was long over. Still, for the Victorians themselves, those who lived through the slow turning of the century, the reckoning came too late. The quiet survivors, not everyone succumbed. Some women, particularly those with education or access to progressive physicians, managed to break free. The process was agonizing, weeks of sleeplessness, trembling, fever. But for those who endured it, Clarity returned like sunlight after years of fog. One such account comes from Lady Charlotte Fitzroy, who in an 1898 letter to a friend described her withdrawal with startling honesty. "The world appears new to me now, though it is cruelly bright. For years I did not dream, did not think, did not feel as others do. I lived between waking and sleep. Now, each hour hurts, yet I am awake again." Her words echo countless unnamed women who made the same painful passage. From the comfort of chemical calm to the rawness of real life, their stories rarely appeared in print, but they formed a quiet foundation for what would later become the field of addiction medicine. They were, in their way, the first to prove that dependence could be broken. The vanishing bottle, by the dawn of the 20th century, Laudanum's once hallowed place in British homes was fading. The apothecaries' counters were lined now with aspirin, quinine, and tonics boasting non-narcotic formulas. Pharmaceutical chemistry had begun to tame the chaos it had created. Still, the bottles lingered, in drawers, in medicine chests, in forgotten corners of cupboards. A grandmother might keep hers, just in case. A widower might take one last dose to help him sleep. The smell, sharp, bitter, faintly sweet, remained familiar long after the habit itself had passed. For historians, these remnants tell quiet stories. A cork crumbling in a bottleneck, a label faded by time-Batley's solution, 1 teaspoon at bedtime, the handwriting on the tag elegant, the poison beneath it invisible. Legacy of a sleeping empire. It's easy now to look back and see the pattern, to mark the Victorian love affair with laudanum as a cautionary tale. But to those who lived it, it was not an affair at all. It was necessity, survival, a means of enduring a world that demanded composure while denying comfort. Laudanum was in many ways the quiet pulse of the 19th century, the heartbeat beneath the corset, the sigh beneath the sermon. It accompanied childbirth, bereavement, insomnia, and inspiration alike. It shaped literature, medicine, and empire itself. And when the world finally woke from its opium dream, it discovered that the story of laudanum was also the story of modernity, progress shadowed by dependence, innovation shadowed by harm. Even today, the parallels remain. The same cycle, discovery, praise, dependence, regret, has repeated with morphine, with heroin, with barbiturates, with modern painkillers. Each age believes it has found a gentler remedy, and each learns in time that every comfort carries its price. The final dose. Picture one last scene. A London bedroom, 1899. The empire stands at its height, but the old century is dying. On a nightstand rests a small glass bottle half full. The label is worn, the cork soft. A woman in her 60s sits by the fire, the orange light flickering across her lined face. She has taken her dose, smaller now than in years past, and waits for the familiar warmth to spread. Outside, carriages pass, and the fog curls against the window panes. For her, this is not sin nor even indulgence. It is ritual, continuity, the quiet bridge between day and night. She will sleep, as she has for decades, beneath the soft weight of the empire's most enduring comfort. Perhaps she does not know that the world is already changing, that doctors are questioning, that laws are coming, that her children's generation will view her medicine with suspicion, even pity. She only knows that the bitterness eases, and the ache softens, and for a few hours, peace returns. The ticking of the clock slows, the city hum fades. Another Laudanum night. And so ends the story of Britain's silent elixir, not with a scandal or a revolution, but with a sigh, a slow withdrawal, a collective awakening, and the faint realization that even the most respectable comforts can conceal deep dependency. The empire would continue. The chemists would adapt. The poets would write of new dreams. But the lesson of laudanum, that peace without pain is rarely peace at all, would linger quietly into the next century. The morning light in a Victorian bedroom came not softly, but with ceremony. Curtains of thick velvet were drawn back by a maid's careful hands, revealing a pale grey dawn filtered through soot and fog. The air was cool, faintly scented with starch, lavender, and coal smoke. From somewhere downstairs came the ticking of a large clock, the steady heartbeat of a household that measured life not by passion, but by schedule. You awaken, perhaps, in the skin of a woman of the 1860s, respectable, well-born, and properly corseted. Your first act of the day is not thought, nor prayer, nor speech, but the ritual of dressing. Before you even rise, your maid has laid out the garments of the morning: a chemise, a pair of drawers, thick stockings, and the corset, that most essential and most controversial symbol of the age. It lies there on the chair like a quiet challenge, pale whalebone and cotton, stiffly laced, narrow at the waist and widening above and below in perfect symmetry. To modern eyes, it might seem an instrument of oppression, or perhaps of vanity. But in its own time, the corset was both armor and identity, a physical manifestation of Victorian womanhood. The corset as clockwork, the act of putting it on required precision. You could not rush, you could not improvise. Every lace and hook was measured, every motion deliberate. Your maid drew the laces tight, slowly, rhythmically, the sound of pulling cords mingling with the clock's ticking. Tighter, tighter still, your ribs compressed, your breath shortened. You felt the pressure not as pain, but as form, the sense that your body was being arranged into its proper silhouette, its moral alignment. To be upright, composed, contained, the Victorians admired the corset not only for its beauty, but for its discipline. It was a machine for posture and propriety, a visible sign that a woman's passions, physical and emotional, were under control. The body was not to be natural, but corrected, like handwriting. Fashion manuals of the time spoke of training the figure, with the same language used for education or religion. The waist must learn obedience, the shoulders must resist indolence. Even the organs, doctors claimed, would adapt with time. In a sense, the corset was a clock, its structure mechanical, its effect measurable. Morning to night, it dictated the rhythm of breath and movement. It forced stillness where emotion might otherwise stir. Every woman, from duchess to shopgirl, felt its influence. For the wealthy, corsets were custom, made lined with silk, boned with whalebone or steel, and laced by servants. For the poor, they were coarse and ill-fitting, bought second-hand from pawnbrokers or stitched together from scraps. Yet the purpose was the same: to shape, to conform, to endure. The geometry of respectability. The Victorians had an obsession with symmetry, not just in architecture or furniture, but in the human form. The ideal female figure was mathematical. The hourglass, a shape that balanced indulgence and restraint. Magazines like the Queen and Godey's Ladies' Book printed illustrations of the perfect waist, often measuring between 18 and 22 inches. The extreme was rare, but the aspiration was universal. Corset advertisements promised not pleasure, but virtue. One 1875 had proclaimed a straight back, a steady carriage, a modest bearing. These are the gifts of our improved stays. The corset was not only a garment, it was a philosophy. A visible declaration that a woman was civilized, moral, and worthy of respect. Her body, like her thoughts, must not wander. In a society obsessed with propriety, physical self-control was a moral duty. The corset became its proof, the body's confession of discipline. Yet beneath that ideal lay discomfort, sometimes suffering, often silence. Women fainted, though not always from vanity, sometimes from lack of air. Doctors debated whether tight lacing caused displaced organs or hysteria, while fashion journals dismissed such worries as unladylike. The truth, as always, depended on class. For a wealthy woman, the corset was a symbol of leisure, proof that she need not labor or bend. For a working woman, it was a daily torment worn beneath hours of physical toil. Both suffered, but differently. Time as virtue, the ticking of the clock downstairs was no accident. In the Victorian home, time itself was a moral instrument. Punctuality, regularity, and order were prized above almost all else. The family's daily life was a schedule of meals, prayers, visits, and rest, each measured with precision. Clocks adorned parlors, dining rooms, even kitchens. To own a clock was to declare one's respectability. Industrialization had synchronized the world. Trains demanded standardized time, factories demanded shifts, schools and offices demanded routine. The personal clock, the corset, mirrored the public one. Together, they created a society wound tight, ticking ceaselessly toward progress. In manuals of etiquette and household management, time and morality were inseparable. A woman who rose late, dallied, or dressed too slowly was described as unreliable. Nervous, awdle, timekeeping was character-keeping. Thus, the corset and the clock formed an invisible partnership. One bound the body, the other bound the day. Both whispered the same lesson: control yourself. The morning machine. After dressing came breakfast. A formal affair even within the home. Coffee, toast, perhaps eggs, all taken while sitting perfectly upright. Speech was measured, manners rehearsed. The corset, by then fully warmed to the body, allowed only shallow breaths. You learned to speak softly, never with animation. To laugh too loudly risked indecency, to sigh too deeply risked disarray. From there, the day unfolded in orderly sequence: correspondence, errands, sewing, lessons with children, visits, tea. Every hour had its appointed use. Leisure itself was scheduled. The corset was your constant companion, your reminder to remain composed. It creaked slightly when you bent, resisted when you turned, and pressed against your ribs when you forgot to hold still. By late afternoon, fatigue set in. The pressure that had seemed empowering in the morning now felt like a weight. Many women loosened their stays privately, just a little, to breathe more freely before tightening them again. Others took a few drops of laudanum, the quiet friend, to ease the ache. The corset and laudanum, two pillars of feminine endurance, often worked hand in hand. One contained the body, the other the mind. Together, they maintained the illusion of composure that Victorian society demanded. The mechanics of morality. Victorian writers often used the language of machinery to describe both industry and virtue. The perfect woman was like a well-oiled clock, steady, reliable, silent. Her beauty lay in precision, not spontaneity. Even in art and literature, women were depicted as serene and symmetrical, the embodiment of control. The corset helped make that image literal. But beneath the rhetoric of virtue there was fear. Fear of disorder, of passion, of chaos. The industrial age had unleashed unprecedented power. Steam, electricity, the expansion of empire. The corset was, in a strange way, a reaction against that chaos, a miniature mechanism of order, worn close to the skin. In sermons and advice books, moralists drew direct parallels between bodily discipline and spiritual purity. A woman who held herself upright was more likely to hold her soul upright as well. Posture was piety. And so, the corset became a form of moral technology, a small domestic machine meant to regulate the self. The hours of a day as evening approached, another ritual began. The changing of clothes. Each part of the day had its own costume: the morning corset, the afternoon corset, and sometimes a lighter version for evening wear. To undress was an act of relief and vulnerability. The loosening of laces brought a rush of breath, a dizzy sense of release. Some women described it as liberation, others as shame. To remove the corset was to be unmade. Doctors, in private correspondence, noted the strange contradiction: women who fainted under the pressure of their stays often refused to loosen them. The habit had become more than fashion, it was identity itself. In time, many no longer remembered what it felt like to move freely. The corset had trained the muscles, reshaped the bones. The body conformed permanently to the hourglass ideal. By night, as the house settled into quiet and the clocks struck their final chime, the woman finally lay down, her breath shallow, her waist tender. She had been punctual, proper, and composed, a model of Victorian virtue. And yet, as the lamplight dimmed, perhaps she wondered what it might feel like to breathe deeply again, to let time slip, to feel her heart beat not by the rhythm of the clock, but by its own. The quiet question, the corset and the clock, twin inventions of order, defined not only fashion and routine, but the very psychology of an era. Together, they shaped a generation of women into living symbols of restraint, endurance, and control. Yet, beneath that surface of perfection, something trembled. The same discipline that built the empire also confined its women, teaching them that to feel deeply was dangerous, to move freely was scandalous, and to rest was indulgence. As the century advanced, the ticking grew louder. Industrialization accelerated. Lives became more regimented. The corset tightened, both literally and metaphorically. But in the faint gaps between those ticking seconds, in letters, diaries, and whispered conversations, another question began to form. Was this perfection worth the breath it cost? When one looks back upon the Victorian age, one often imagines the crinoline, the bustle, and the stiff collars of gentlemen, a world of rigid fabrics and unyielding forms. But to live within that world was to feel it pressing in from all sides, as much a system of architecture as of morality. The corset stood at the very center of that system, a device so ordinary that it seemed almost invisible, and yet so powerful that it shaped both posture and psychology. The corset's material, whalebone, steel, cotton, belonged as much to the age of machinery as to the world of fashion. It was an industrial object for domestic use, built with the same principles of design that drove the engines of steamships and railways. The whalebone, actually baleen from the mouth of the whale, was flexible but firm, a marvel of organic engineering. Steel, introduced later in the century, was stronger, colder, more precise. The corset industry itself was enormous. In the 1850s, London and Paris produced millions of stays each year, employing thousands of women and girls who stitched and laced for long hours in dim workshops. Their hands bled from needles, their backs ached from stooping. Yet they labored to produce the garments that symbolized grace and leisure for others. It was a quiet irony of the age. The tool that signified refinement for one class was built by the exhaustion of another. The anatomy of confinement, the corset began, in theory, as a support, a way to improve posture and distribute the weight of heavy skirts. But its moral function quickly overtook its practical one. Manuals insisted that proper tight lacing encouraged modesty, self-control, and even chastity. Medical men, ever eager to join moral discussions, published contradictory opinions. Some claimed that a well-fitted corset was healthful, preventing drooping of the viscera. Others decried it as a vice of civilization. One London physician wrote in 1869, "The corset is both the symptom and the disease. It reveals the vanity of woman and inflicts her punishment." His tone was moral, not medical. The female body, in his view, was an unstable thing in constant need of regulation, a machine requiring adjustment. The language of mechanics infused nearly every description. The corset had springs, ribs, fastenings. Women's magazines discussed pressure points and load distribution, with the same precision that engineers used to describe bridges. To wear one properly was to become part machine oneself, a moving structure held in balance by restraint. The ritual of measurement in respectable dressmaking establishments. Fittings were quiet ceremonies. A woman stood before a mirror in her chemise while the corsetter circled her with measuring tape. "Stand straight," the fitter would murmur, "shoulders back. Do not breathe too deeply." The waist was measured first, the holy number of the Victorian silhouette. A difference of half an inch could separate elegance from vulgarity. The measurements were recorded in neat handwriting in a ledger, often alongside notes like, "requires more rigidity," or "prefers narrow front busk." It was a process of calibration, not comfort. The corset was adjusted until the body conformed, not the other way around. For many women, especially those of the upper middle class, this ritual was as intimate as confession. To submit to measurement was to acknowledge imperfection, to accept the moral architecture of one's time. In some cases, corset fitters acted almost like physicians, diagnosing postural faults, prescribing new laces, or recommending stricter shaping. Girls as young as 10 were often introduced to corset training, for the sake of habit and future grace. By adolescence, the body had learned obedience. The language of pain in the Victorian world was rarely spoken of directly. To suffer silently was a virtue, to complain was vulgar. Women's diaries from the period often reveal discomfort only obliquely. A lady might note feeling faint at tea, or that "my stays were unusually tight today." In those phrases lay entire worlds of suppressed sensation. Doctors recorded fainting fits, shallow breathing, digestive troubles, and curvature of the spine, but they rarely connected these ailments to the corset. Instead, they attributed them to female constitution, nervous disposition, or moral excitability. A one might tighten her stays before attending a ball, faint gracefully while dancing, and be praised for delicacy rather than pitied for suffocation. The act of fainting, once tied to religious ecstasy, had become a kind of social performance, a bodily expression of refinement. Laudanum, again, was ever present. Advertisements promised relief for nervous tension and female weakness. In truth, it dulled the aches of whalebone and wire, easing women into a half-conscious acceptance of their own constriction. The economy of control, the corset trade, revealed much about the structure of Victorian society itself. It was an industry that thrived on contradiction, built by poor women, sold to rich ones, praised by men for moral reasons, worn by women in physical suffering. Factories in London, Birmingham, and Manchester employed armies of women who worked 12 hours a day for pennies. They sewed, cut, pressed, and packed under the supervision of male managers who enforced strict quotas. Each corset required dozens of pieces: panels of fabric, lengths of boning, metal eyelets, silk thread. The most expensive used imported whalebone from Greenland or steel from Sheffield. Even the humblest stays represented hundreds of small acts of labor, most of them invisible. Advertisements spoke of beauty and comfort, but the reality was sweat and exhaustion. One inspector reported in 1883, "The atmosphere is heavy with steam and starch. The girls are pale, stooping, their fingers pricked and sore. Yet they work with surprising cheer, for idleness is worse." Such was the morality of the age. Work, even painful work, was virtue. Discipline was godliness. And in that sense, the corset was a perfect product of its time, a fusion of moral ideal, industrial process, and physical constraint. The rebellion beneath the lace, yet not all submitted quietly. By the 1870s, murmurs of resistance began to circulate. Doctors like Dr. Richard Corson and Lady Habberton's Rational Dress Society began to question tight lacing openly. The rational dress movement encouraged looser clothing, healthier silhouettes, and natural movement. But the public viewed these reformers with suspicion. To reject the corset was to reject civilization itself. Newspapers mocked the uncorseted woman as a curiosity, masculine, unfeminine, even dangerous. One satirical cartoon in Punch magazine depicted a woman without stays as a jellyfish. Without support, without structure, without virtue. Still, the movement grew quietly, supported by intellectual women, writers, and artists. They spoke not of fashion, but of freedom, the right to breathe, to move, to exist without pain. The controversy reflected a deeper unease in Victorian society, the tension between progress and propriety. Machines had made life faster, brighter, louder, yet the human body was still expected to remain perfectly still. The hidden machinery of time, meanwhile, the ticking clock continued its silent dominion. Each household synchronized itself with railway time, church bells, and the factory whistle. Time was now measurable, divisible, and inescapable. Women's lives, though confined to domestic spaces, were increasingly ruled by these mechanical rhythms. The corset was both a response and a symbol, a personal clockwork that aligned the body with the new industrial order. Even fashion plates reflected this mechanical precision. Dresses were described in inches and proportions, silhouettes followed geometric formulas. The waist became a pivot point, around which fabric and fabrications revolved like cogs. Writers of the time often described women as ornaments of the household clock. They were to mark the hours gracefully: breakfast at 8, luncheon at 1, tea at 4, dinner at 7. The smallest deviation suggested moral failure. In that sense, the corset was not merely personal, it was social. It kept the woman, and by extension, the home, in proper alignment with the great machinery of Victorian life. The breath between seconds, but time, like the corset, could be bent only so far before it strained. As the century wore on, women began to feel the pressure not only of whalebone but of expectation. The ideals of composure, purity, and punctuality left little room for individual desire. Many found subtle ways to resist, loosening their stays, feigning illness, retreating to their rooms under the guise of female nerves. There, behind closed doors, they could at last exhale. Letters from women of the era often described these moments of private release. One wrote in 1878, "When the day's duties are done and the laces are loosed, I breathe again, and remember that I am alive beneath all this." Another confessed, "I sometimes remove my stays before bed and place my hand upon my ribs, feeling them rise and fall. It is a small rebellion, but it is mine." These confessions reveal not just discomfort, but awakening, the beginning of a quiet realization that the body, so long restrained, had its own will. The fraying of order by the final decades of the 19th century, the perfect order of the Victorian household began to fray. Industrial unrest, women's suffrage, and new scientific ideas all challenged the old hierarchies. Fashion, too, began to change. The corset remained, but its shape shifted, higher in the bust, shorter at the waist, more flexible. The silhouette became less architectural, more human. Some women abandoned it altogether, adopting the loose gowns of the aesthetic movement. These garments, inspired by medieval and classical styles, allowed natural movement and breath. To wear one was to make a statement, not of beauty, but of refusal. Still, for most, the corset remained a habit too deeply ingrained to abandon. It was part of the body now, part of identity. The clock still ticked. The day still demanded discipline. And yet, within that steady rhythm, small moments of stillness began to appear. The breath between the seconds, the loosened lace, the whispered thought, perhaps there is another way to live. The Victorian woman lived suspended between two forces, the mechanical and the human, the disciplined and the desiring. She was the embodiment of a paradox, the living machine, graceful under pressure, fragile in silence. But as the century approached its close, the ticking of the clock grew less certain. The age of certainty itself began to falter. Night falls gently over London in the 1890s. The lamps along Regent Street flicker with gaslight, and the air smells faintly of fog and smoke. Through a tall window on the second floor of a respectable townhouse, a woman stands before a mirror. Her maid has left. The house is quiet except for the ticking of a clock somewhere downstairs. With careful hands, she begins to unlace her corset. The sound of the silk cords slipping through metal eyelets is soft, rhythmic, a reverse heartbeat. Slowly, the tension loosens. Her breath deepens. A faint red mark runs around her waist like a delicate bruise, a map of discipline etched upon the skin. This simple act, removing the corset, was in its time both ordinary and profound. For a Victorian woman, to take off her stays was to step momentarily outside the machinery of the day, to feel, if only for a few hours, the unmeasured rhythm of her own body. And as the 19th century drew to its close, the entire society seemed to be performing the same gesture, slowly, hesitantly, unbinding itself from the rigid forms that had defined it. The body and the machine for most of the century, The corset had served as both symbol and instrument of order. It stood for self-control, morality, and respectability, the visible proof that a woman, and by extension her household, was properly maintained. But by the 1890s, that order was beginning to crack. Factories had grown vast and impersonal. The rhythm of industrial time, once the great pride of progress, had begun to feel oppressive. In literature, art, and medicine, new voices questioned whether the body could endure such precision without breaking. Women's movements gained strength. The campaign for suffrage found its earliest recruits among those who had already defied fashion. Women who refused to lace themselves into silence. Writers like Olive Schreiner, artists of the aesthetic movement, and physicians in the New Woman circles began to connect physical freedom with intellectual freedom. To loosen one's corset was to loosen one's life. At the same time, technology itself was changing shape. The clock was no longer only mechanical, electricity had arrived. Trains ran faster, telegraphs clicked endlessly, and the empire stretched across oceans. Yet within drawing rooms, parlors, and bedrooms, women still moved with measured grace, breathing shallowly beneath stays that belonged to another century. The rational dress movement of the late Victorian era, while small, carried ideas far greater than fashion. It began as a practical matter, a protest against fainting fatigue, and the physical harm caused by tight lacing. Doctors, journalists, and reformers spoke of compressed lungs, weakened spines, and miscarriages. But the argument quickly became moral, even philosophical. If a woman could not breathe, could she truly think freely? Societies were formed in London, Manchester, and Edinburgh. Pamphlets circulated with titles like The Tyranny of the Corset and The Freedom of the Figure. They urged women to abandon the instruments of their servitude, and not all who read them dared to follow. To appear in public without a corset was to risk ridicule or scandal, but small acts of rebellion multiplied. Looser lacing, softer boning, the introduction of elastic panels and adjustable stays. By the mid-1890s, designers like Liberty & Co. and Lady Duff, Gordon's Maison Lucelle began to promote gowns that emphasized natural movement. Garments meant to flow, not confine. In quiet defiance, women began to walk faster, breathe deeper, and sit more freely. The clock still ticked, but its rhythm was no longer absolute. The unraveling of perfection, yet, for every woman who embraced reform, another clung tightly to the old ways. The corset, after all, had become more than fashion. It was habit, ritual, identity. To abandon it entirely felt like stepping into chaos. Society still demanded the appearance of composure. The respectable woman was defined by her stillness, her neatness, her contained grace. Even those who secretly loosened their stays by night tightened them again by morning. Many could not imagine facing the world without the reassurance of that familiar pressure, the physical reminder of who they were supposed to be. The corset had, in its way, become a comfort. Not because it was kind, but because it was known. This tension, between comfort and freedom, between habit and change, defined the final decades of the century. The same struggle echoed in art, in science, and in empire. Everywhere old forms were being tested, and the cost of rigidity was becoming clear. The whisper of air to stand in a room without a corset was to rediscover the body's language. Women who had spent years confined began to notice sensations long forgotten. The expansion of the lungs, the warmth of breath, the rise and fall of the diaphragm. The body, once an object to be arranged, became something to be listened to. Writers of the period, particularly those aligned with the aesthetic and pre-Raphaelite movements, began to celebrate this rediscovery of natural form. Paintings by artists like Edward Burne-Jones and John William Waterhouse depicted women not as rigid icons, but as living beings. Draped in flowing fabrics, their waists unbound, their gestures human. In literature, too, the language shifted. The heroines of George Gissing and Thomas Hardy no longer fit neatly into the corseted mold of propriety. They were restless, questioning, flawed. Their stories rarely ended happily, but they were alive in a way that Victorian angels never were. Even Queen Victoria herself, whose mourning dress and rigid propriety had once set the tone for the entire empire, began to seem like a relic of an older world, a symbol of stillness in an age beginning to move. The mechanics of freedom, however, came not with noise but with quiet adjustment. As corsets softened, so too did their symbolism. By 1900, the S-shaped health corset replaced the straight-backed stays of earlier decades. It was meant to relieve pressure from the waist, though in truth it merely shifted it elsewhere. Still, the intention had changed. The corset was now a garment of comfort rather than control. More significantly, women themselves had changed. Education for girls expanded. Employment opportunities grew. Bicycles appeared, and with them, bloomers, a scandalous but liberating innovation. The bicycle, in its way, did what pamphlets could not. It made breathing a necessity. One writer observed in 1896, "The bicycle does more to emancipate women than 100 sermons. One cannot ride and be laced at once." Each pedal stroke, each gust of wind against an unbound waist, was a small act of revolution. The corset, once the symbol of progress and virtue, began to look outdated, a relic of a slower, more obedient time. The clock itself was changing too. Pocket watches gave way to wristwatches, time grew portable, personal, and the strict synchronization of the Victorian day began to loosen. The ghost of the hourglass, yet, like all ghosts, the corset never vanished entirely. Even after its decline, it lingered in posture, in gesture, in expectation. The modern ideal of the female figure, slender waist, upright carriage, composed demeanor, is the descendant of that mechanical silhouette. The Victorian woman may have unlaced her stays, but the lessons of discipline remained stitched into memory. That beauty requires effort, that control is grace, that silence is strength. In this way, the corset survived the century not as a garment, but as an idea. Its shape can still be traced in the stiff lines of early 20th century fashion, in the girdles of the 1930s, in the cinched belts of the 1950s. Each age, in its own manner, remade the hourglass. Even now the metaphor persists, the desire to compress chaos into order, to measure worth by symmetry. The corset and the clock, those twin engines of Victorian control, may have fallen silent, but their rhythm still echoes faintly beneath the surface of modern life. The final unbinding. Imagine again that quiet Victorian bedroom. The woman before the mirror now stands in her nightgown, her stays folded neatly on the chair beside her. She runs her fingers over the faint marks on her skin, red lines fading into pale flesh. The clock downstairs continues to tick, indifferent, precise. She draws a deep breath, her first unmeasured breath of the day. Outside, the city murmurs, carriage wheels on cobblestones, the hiss of gas lamps being extinguished. Somewhere far away, a factory whistle marks the changing of shifts. But within this small room, for this brief moment, there is no time, only the slow rise and fall of breath. It is in that pause, that fragile stillness, that the age begins to end, for history does not change all at once. It loosens slowly, lace by lace, breath by breath, until one morning a woman wakes and finds that the air moves more freely, that her posture is her own, that she can stand not because she must, but because she chooses to. And though she will still hear the ticking of the clock, she will no longer confuse its rhythm with her own. The corset, the clock, and the woman who wore them, each was a mechanism of its time, precise and disciplined. But even the best wound clock must one day unwind, and even the strongest stays must one day break their threads. When they did, a new century began, one that breathed a little deeper. You are sitting in a small English parlor, sometime around 1845. The afternoon light slants through lace curtains, painting soft patterns on the carpet. On a low table before you sits a porcelain cup, thin, pale, edged with gold. The steam that curls from it smells faintly of earth and grass, sharp yet comforting. It is tea. You lift the cup, and in that simple gesture, the turn of a wrist, the touch of porcelain to lip, you hold centuries of empire, commerce, and quiet rebellion. Tea, by the middle of the 19th century, was more than a drink. It was the rhythm of British life, the silent metronome of a nation that ruled 1/4 of the world. Morning tea before work, afternoon tea to punctuate the long day, evening tea by the hearth, poured with slow grace. But the story of how it came to be there, in that delicate cup, is one of uneasy balance between purity and addiction, between ritual and empire, between the comfort of the domestic and the violence of the colonial. The birth of a habit. The British did not always drink tea. In fact, the habit was once regarded with suspicion. When tea first arrived from China in the mid-1600s, it was a rare and costly novelty, a curiosity sold by apothecaries, praised for its supposed medicinal virtues. Early drinkers claimed it sharpened the mind and soothed the nerves. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, recorded his first taste in 1660, noting it with mild curiosity. "I did send for a cup of tea, a China drink of which I never had drunk before." By the early 18th century, tea had begun to infiltrate British society. The East India Company, already dealing in spices, textiles, and opium, saw an opportunity. It poured vast resources into importing Chinese tea leaves, marketing them not as medicine, but as refinement. Porcelain teapots, delicate cups, and carved caddies became symbols of civility. Tea was slow, orderly, and respectable, qualities that fit neatly into a society increasingly obsessed with manners and self-control. By the 1800s, it was no longer an elite indulgence. Even the poorest workers, when wages allowed, would buy small quantities of cheap tea and sugar. The drink had become democratic, the fuel of both the drawing room and the factory floor. Sugar and the taste of empire, but tea, as every cup reminded its drinkers, was not grown in Britain. Its sweetness, that comforting spoonful of sugar stirred into the amber liquid, carried with it the weight of slavery and empire. For most of the 18th and early 19th centuries, British sugar came from the Caribbean, from Jamaica, Barbados, and other colonies worked by enslaved Africans. Every sip of sweetened tea connected the drawing rooms of London to the brutal heat of a plantation thousands of miles away. The polite clink of porcelain in a parlor was the echo of machetes cutting through cane. Even after slavery was formally abolished in 1833, the structure of exploitation remained. The same plantations continued to operate, now with indentured laborers brought from India and China. The sweetness in the cup had not changed, only its legal definition had. Tea was comfort. Tea was routine. But beneath that calm surface lay the restless machinery of global trade, ships, tariffs, wars, and the slow reshaping of entire continents to satisfy British taste. The opium behind the steam. If sugar sweetened the cup, opium filled it. By the 1830s, Britain's thirst for tea had grown so vast that it created a crisis. China, the only major producer, demanded payment in silver. Britain's silver reserves dwindled. To balance the trade, the East India Company began to sell opium, grown in India, to Chinese merchants. The logic was coldly efficient. Tea flowed one way, opium the other. The result was catastrophic. Millions in China became addicted. The Qing government, desperate to stop the flood, seized and destroyed shipments of opium. Britain responded with force. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, began. A conflict fought to protect a nation's right to drug another nation's people in the name of trade. When the smoke cleared, Britain had secured new ports, new privileges, and the continuation of its tea habit. The tea in your parlor cup, by mid-century, was steeped not only in water, but in the memory of war. Most drinkers, of course, never thought of it that way. They were too busy working, resting, living. Tea was their comfort, their small reward, their anchor in the long, grey days of the industrial age. The ritual of restraint. By the time Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837, tea had achieved something remarkable. It had become moral. Unlike gin or oil, tea did not intoxicate. It did not lead to ruin or riot. It was the beverage of order, discipline, and virtue, the liquid embodiment of the Protestant work ethic. Factory owners encouraged their workers to drink tea during breaks, believing it kept them alert and sober. In middle-class homes, afternoon tea evolved into an institution, a space of gentility where one could momentarily escape the grime of the outside world. Tea became the ritual of restraint. The temperance movement, rising during this same period, seized on it as an alternative to alcohol. Reformers like the Quakers and Methodists championed tea as a moral drink, pure, sober, domestic. Tea rooms sprang up across cities, offering a respectable alternative to taverns. Women, often excluded from public houses, could gather and converse over tea without scandal. The drink became a quiet instrument of social change, a symbol of virtue that also, unintentionally, gave women new spaces of independence. Tea and the domestic clock. If gin belonged to the streets, tea belonged to the home. It marked the rhythm of domestic life. Breakfast tea at dawn. Luncheon tea for those who could afford leisure. Afternoon tea, a pause between day and night. Evening tea by the hearth, a signal of closure. Each pot was prepared with near religious care. The warming of the pot, the correct ratio of leaves, the proper steeping time. The entire ritual was an assertion of control in an age of industrial chaos. In cities choked by smoke and noise, the teapot was a small sanctuary of calm. Even the choice of tea said something about class and character. The working poor drank strong, dark Assam or cheap blends. The middle classes favoured Darjeeling or Ceylon. The aristocracy prized Chinese teas, delicate, floral, expensive. To know your tea was to know your place. The temperance challenge. Yet, like all comforts, tea's moral purity was eventually contested. By the late 1800s, the temperance movement had begun to turn its attention beyond alcohol. Reformers worried about caffeine, about indulgence, about the very notion of pleasure tied to consumption. Tea, they argued, might not intoxicate the body, but it could dull the will. Too much tea, some claimed, led to nervous exhaustion, a complaint often diagnosed in women of the middle class. Doctors wrote of tea drunkenness, describing symptoms that ranged from tremors to melancholy. For the first time, the perfect domestic drink came under scrutiny. Some reformers even linked tea to moral decay, suggesting that it fostered gossip, idleness, and vanity. Others saw it as a symptom of empire's excess. a habit built on exploitation and luxury. The same drink that once symbolized restraint now stood accused of indulgence. Steam and steel. While moralists debated, the world outside was changing faster than ever. By the 1850s, the clipper ships that carried tea from China to Britain were marvels of engineering. Sleek vessels built for speed, their masts cutting through the wind like knives. The annual tea races became famous ships like the Cutty Sark and the Thermopylae, racing from the ports of Fukao or Shanghai to the docks of London, each vying to deliver the first cargo of the season. The journey, once 6 months long, could now be made in 90 days, and yet, within a few decades, even these beautiful ships would be rendered obsolete. Steam replaced sail, the Suez Canal shortened routes, refrigeration and telegraphy reshaped global trade. Tea continued to flow, but now it came not from China, but from India and Ceylon, lands the British controlled directly. Plantations spread across Assam and the Sri Lankan highlands, replacing local forests and labour systems. Entire regions were remade to suit the British palate. A cup of tea had become the empire itself, compact, familiar, and profoundly distant from its origins. The quiet rebellion of the cup. Despite its imperial roots, tea carried within it the potential for quiet rebellion. In Ireland, tea became a symbol of resistance, a mark of civility and independence among those long denied both. In India, nationalist movements later used the image of tea pickers to critique the very empire that had forced them into labour. Even in Britain, the teapot became a tool of agency. Women's suffrage meetings were often held over tea, and the beverage that once reinforced domestic boundaries began to dissolve them. There was power in the ritual, not the loud, political kind, but the slow, patient power of endurance. To pour tea was to assert order, even in disorder. It was an act of survival disguised as civility. The paradox of comfort. By the century's end, tea had become nearly invisible, so ordinary that no one thought to question it. Its history of conquest, slavery, and addiction lay buried beneath porcelain and sugar. What remained was the illusion of peace, a cup of warmth held between wary hands, a moment's pause in the endless ticking of the industrial day. But history has a way of lingering in the smallest things. Every sip carried traces of journeys across oceans, of labourers in distant fields, of wars fought for leaves and silver. The empire that ruled by trade had hidden itself inside the most innocent of habits. To drink tea was to participate in a vast, invisible system, one so complete that it seemed natural. And so, as the 19th century drifted toward its close, a new question began to rise quietly beneath the clinking of teacups. If even our comforts are born of conquest, can anything we consume ever be truly pure? The year is 1872. A pharmacist in Manchester stands behind his polished wooden counter, the air around him sharp with the scent of alcohol, camphor, and crushed herbs. Rows of glass bottles line the shelves, some filled with golden liquid, others dark and mysterious. Each bears a neat, hand-lettered label: Elixir of Health, Dr. Collis Brown's Chlorodyne, Godfrey's Cordial, Turlington's Balsam of Life. The pharmacist moves deliberately, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, his hands steady. A woman enters, dressed in morning black, and asks in a low voice for a bottle of tonic, something for her nerves. The pharmacist nods, reaches for a familiar bottle, and wraps it carefully in brown paper. Outside, the street hums with carriages and footsteps. The factory whistles blow. Inside, the woman clutches her parcel and walks away, unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, that what she carries is more than medicine. It is comfort in liquid form. It is respectability's secret indulgence. It is, more often than not, tinctured with alcohol, opium, or cocaine. This is the age of the tonic, the second great wave of Britain's quiet addictions. A nation in need of nerves, the Industrial Revolution, which had filled Britain's cities with light, noise, and work, had also filled its people with exhaustion. Doctors wrote of neurasthenia, a new kind of fatigue born not of poverty, but of civilization itself, the weariness of those who lived by the factory bell and the railway timetable. The body, they said, could no longer keep pace with the machine. For women, the diagnosis was nervousness. For men, overstrain. The treatment for both was remarkably similar: a tonic, a cordial, a restorative, something to quicken the blood and soothe the nerves. The ingredients were, by modern standards, startling. Laudanum opium dissolved in alcohol was among the most common, along with chloroform, morphine, and ether. Cocaine found its way into patent medicines by the 1880s, often advertised as invigorating. One bottle might promise to restore youth and vitality. Another might relieve melancholy, palpitations, and nervous distress. The labels were elegant, the advertisements persuasive, and they worked. at least for a while. Medicine or morality, the line between treatment and temptation blurred easily in the 19th century. Chemistry had advanced rapidly, but regulation had not. Patent medicines were sold freely, without prescription, often through mail-order catalogues or traveling salesmen. There was no requirement to list ingredients, no warning labels, no oversight. Mothers gave soothing syrups to infants, unaware that they contained opium. Clerks dosed themselves with tonics to stay awake through 12-hour shifts. The respectable middle classes, who scorned the gin shops of the poor, kept bottles of cordial in their cabinets, tonics that delivered the same effect in more refined packaging. For many, this was not hypocrisy, but necessity. The age was one of relentless fatigue. Pain was private and medicine was self-administered. A spoonful of something strong was often the only reprieve from the grind of daily life. In a way, the tonic bottle was the industrial counterpart to the teapot, both instruments of control, both rituals of self-preservation. The difference was that one soothed the nerves, and the other numbed them. The hidden drinker temperance reformers, however, saw through the illusion. By the mid-19th century, the temperance movement had grown powerful. It was a movement of moral clarity, a crusade against the destruction wrought by alcohol among the working classes. Slogans appeared on pamphlets and posters. Lips that touch liquor shall not touch mine. Temperance halls replaced taverns. Coffee houses and tea rooms multiplied. Societies such as the British Women's Temperance Association preached sobriety as both salvation and social advancement. Yet the irony was thick as steam from a kettle. While the temperance women railed against gin and beer, many of them relied, quietly, desperately, on tonics that were just as intoxicating. A teaspoon of chlorodyne for headaches, a cordial for sleeplessness, a draught for female troubles. It was not hypocrisy so much as contradiction, the collision of moral aspiration with medical ignorance. To be respectably medicated was acceptable, to be drunk was not. The difference lay not in chemistry but in context. The bottle behind the apothecary's counter was a shield against shame. The tonic empire, as the century progressed, the British Empire turned its appetite for stimulants into an economy of its own. Quinine, derived from the bark of the cinchona tree in South America, became essential to life in the tropics, the only effective treatment for malaria. It was bitter, unpleasant, but life-saving. Soldiers and colonists learned to take their daily dose mixed with sugar and soda water. Thus was born the gin and tonic. At first, it was medicine. Soon, it became ritual. The bitterness of the tonic, the burn of the gin. Together they symbolized the empire's uneasy balance between health and indulgence. The British abroad drank to survive, but also to forget. By the late 19th century, tonic water itself had become a fashionable beverage back home. Schweppes Indian Tonic appeared in advertisements adorned with colonial imagery, elephants, palm trees, and the shining sun of empire. The taste of the empire had been domesticated, bottled and carbonated. The very thing that once cured disease now cured boredom, women weakness, and the medical market. The Victorian medical profession had a particular fascination with women's nerves. Doctors diagnosed hysteria with alarming frequency, attributing everything from anxiety to ambition as symptoms of a fragile constitution. The prescribed cure often was rest and medication. The pattern was familiar. A woman feeling trapped or restless might be told to stay indoors, avoid intellectual exertion, and take her tonic regularly. The tonic, in turn, often contained opium or alcohol, ensuring that she remained calm, compliant, and dependent. Middle-class women, bound by expectations of gentility, found in these medicines a socially acceptable outlet for distress. To be unwell was permissible, to be discontent was not. Advertisers knew this well. Victorian magazines were filled with graceful illustrations of ladies sipping from small glasses of restorative cordial, surrounded by flowers and cherubs. The language was gentle. The implications clear. Here was a way to maintain composure, to preserve the appearance of peace. In truth, it was sedation dressed as self-care. The age of adulteration, meanwhile, in the factories that bottled these elixirs, conditions were far from elegant. Industrial chemistry made mass production possible, but purity remained elusive. Without regulation, adulteration was common. Tonic makers stretched ingredients with cheaper substances, chalk resin, lead compounds. The infamous Lancet adulteration reports of the 1850s exposed shocking practices: milk diluted with water, bread whitened with alum, and patent medicines containing little of what they claimed. Yet the public, accustomed to trusting labels, continued to buy. The act of purchase itself carried a sense of faith in science, in progress, in the promise that every bottle contained the best of the modern world. It was a faith not easily shaken, even by scandal. The gospel of clean living. By the 1880s, the temperance movement began to expand its focus. It was no longer only about abstaining from alcohol, but about embracing a new ideal of clean living. Health became moral currency. To bathe regularly, to eat plainly, to exercise, these became marks of virtue. A pure body was seen as the sign of a pure soul, and so, paradoxically, the same industrial society that had driven people to exhaustion now demanded that they manage their own well-being with discipline and restraint. The tonic bottle began to lose its innocence. Reformers demanded labeling laws. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 finally restricted the sale of poisons, including opium, to licensed chemists. Later, the Sale of Food and Drugs Act 1875 began the slow process of regulating ingredients. A new language of health emerged, one that prized moderation, balance, and self-control. The age of miracle tonics gave way to the age of science. But the hunger for relief did not fade, it simply changed its shape. Coffee, cocoa, and the modern mind. As opium faded from respectability, caffeine stepped quietly into its place. Coffee, once associated with radicalism and masculine debate, became the drink of the industrious modern. Cocoa, marketed by Quaker companies like Cadbury and Fry's, was promoted as a wholesome, moral alternative, a cup of comfort without sin. These new beverages carried the moral tone of temperance, but still offered stimulation. They were safe, social, and unifying, a way to stay alert in a world that never stopped moving. Factories now ran on caffeine instead of alcohol. The office worker replaced the opium dreamer. The moral war against intoxication had not ended indulgence, it had only domesticated it. The bitter aftertaste. By the end of the century, Britain was a nation of self-medicators, but now they called it self-care. Tonics had been replaced by tonics of another kind, early health foods, carbonated waters, and invigorating non-alcoholic beverages. The rituals of consumption had changed, but the motivations had not. People still sought the same things: energy, relief, composure, escape, only in bottles labeled pure. It was a new form of faith, and like all faiths, it relied on forgetting what came before. The temperance halls stood where gin shops once did. The apothecary shelves gleamed with safe alternatives. But behind every new cure lay the same human desire, the quiet, universal wish to feel better, to feel normal, to feel anything at all. And so the question lingered, subtle as the aftertaste of quinine. If every age must invent its own medicine for the mind, how do we tell the difference between cure and comfort? Imagine London at the turn of the 20th century, a city humming like a vast machine, powered not by steam alone but by ritual. The railway whistles cry at dawn, the presses rumble through the night, and through every street, every home, flows a constant undercurrent of liquid habit. Tea in the morning, coffee at the office, cocoa before bed, tonic water, ginger beer, sarsaparilla, the alphabet of the empire's thirst. The grand battles of temperance had mostly faded by 1900. The gin palaces still glittered, but now they shared their glow with tea rooms, soda fountains, and coffee stalls. The struggle between intoxication and purity had not been won, only absorbed into the routines of everyday life. This was not the victory the reformers imagined, nor was it the defeat the drinkers feared. It was something quieter, subtler, a truce disguised as progress. The birth of the tea room, the temperance movement, though moralistic in tone, left behind something unexpectedly liberating. Out of its crusade for sobriety grew the modern cafe culture, polite, respectable spaces where people could meet without alcohol. Tea rooms, often operated by women, became social hubs for a new class of workers and travelers. Imagine the year is 1905 and you step into a Lion's Tea Room on Oxford Street. The air smells faintly of pastries and strong Ceylon tea. Mirrors line the walls. Waitresses in crisp white aprons move briskly between tables. It is bright, clean, and affordable, open to women, children, clerks, and typists alike. For many, it is the first public space where they can sit alone without drawing suspicion. The tea room is more than a business, it is a small revolution. It offers a moment of dignity in the middle of a working day, a pause in a life measured by factory whistles and office bells. Here one can speak freely, read, rest, or simply breathe. In that sense, the temperance movement, for all its moral rigidity, helped democratize leisure. The workers brew outside the city's polished tea rooms, the working classes cultivated a parallel ritual. In factories and mines, tea was not poured from porcelain but from dented tin kettles and enamel mugs. It was thick, black, and strong, more sustenance than refreshment. Boiling water was often safer than local water supplies, and tea, with its caffeine and sugar, offered both comfort and calories. It became a necessity rather than a luxury. the cheapest way to keep warm and awake through 12-hour shifts. By 1910, tea breaks were recognized as a basic feature of industrial labor. The short pause to brew and sip became institutionalized, a kind of humane interruption in the rhythm of production. No parliament had decreed it. No law had enforced it. It had simply emerged, an unwritten pact between workers and fatigue. If the factory was the heart of the industrial age, the teapot was its pulse. Advertising the everyday as Britain entered the 20th century, tea and tonic had become industries in themselves. Driven by the new language of advertising, billboards and newspapers no longer sold only goods, they sold ideals. Thai food tea for health. Schweppes, the sparkle of life. Drink cocoa for strength and purity. The language of morality had been replaced by the language of vitality. Where temperance had preached abstinence, advertising promised energy. Tea was no longer about restraint, it was about recovery. Tonic was no longer medicine, it was modernity. Every bottle and packet offered a small promise. That with the right drink, one might overcome fatigue, rise above circumstance, and embody the ideal of progress. The empire itself seemed to hum through these slogans. The plantation fields of Assam and Ceylon, the sugar mills of the Caribbean, the shipping lanes of the Indian Ocean, all were hidden within the cheerful simplicity of a poster on a London wall. Consumption had replaced conscience. The moral chemistry of caffeine. By the 1920s, caffeine had become the acceptable stimulant of civilization. It kept typists alert, drivers awake, soldiers vigilant. It fueled the telephone exchange, the newsroom, and the classroom. It was stimulant as discipline, energy in service of productivity, but its moral reputation remained spotless. Unlike alcohol, it sharpened rather than softened, it enabled rather than escaped. Science, newly confident, explained this difference in biological terms. The chemistry of neurotransmitters, the absence of intoxication. Yet the moral distinction was older and deeper. Caffeine fit the rhythm of the clock. It made one efficient, punctual, awake. Opium had lulled, gin had blurred. Tea and coffee focused. They aligned the human body with the machine. In that sense, the shift from narcotic to stimulant was not just medical, it was ideological. The modern world preferred those who stayed awake. The global cup beyond Britain's shores, the story of tea and tonic continued to unfold in more complicated ways. In India, the British Tea Committee launched campaigns to teach Indians to drink tea, the English way, with milk and sugar. In an attempt to expand the domestic market, posters showed Indian villagers smiling over steaming cups, slogans proclaiming, "Tea revives you." The irony was bitter. The very drink that symbolized British civility had been cultivated through colonial labor, and now the colonized were being instructed in how to consume it. In Africa, quinine plantations spread through East Africa to supply tonic water. In the Caribbean, sugar remained the unspoken foundation of every sweetened beverage. Each cup in London still contained the distant echoes of empire, though fewer now cared to hear them. The feminine cup within Britain, the cultural associations of tea remained distinctly feminine. Tea was domesticity, patience and care, the soft labor of hospitality. Coffee, by contrast, retained a masculine edgy, urban, intellectual, brisk. But even this quiet gender divide began to shift. During the First World War, women working in munitions factories organized communal tea breaks. They brewed in tin buckets over gas stoves, their aprons dusted with powder. Tea became a symbol of endurance, not gentility, a comfort shared between equals in exhaustion. Advertisements after the war reflected this change. The dainty illustrations of lace and porcelain gave way to images of energy and solidarity, a worker smiling over her mug, a soldier warming his hands around a tin cup. Tea had shed its lace and learned to stand. The slow decline of temperance, the temperance movement, once so fierce, had lost its moral authority by the 1930s. Its rigid codes of virtue felt outdated in a world of cinema, radio, and jazz. Yet its legacy endured, not in prohibition, but in moderation. The idea that moral strength was tied to bodily control lingered in public health campaigns, school lessons, and social expectations. Even as alcohol returned to respectability, the old binary remained: some drinks made one respectable, others did not. Tea, coffee, cocoa, tonic. They formed a pantheon of virtue, each a small daily ritual of civility. To drink them was to participate in the quiet maintenance of order. The science of the sip. By mid-century, laboratories replaced apothecaries. Tonics became vitamins. Cordials became supplements. Restoratives turned into brand name energy drinks. The language changed, but the promise stayed the same: strength, composure, recovery. Doctors now prescribed lifestyle rather than laudanum. Advertisers spoke of wellness rather than morality. Yet both still addressed the same fear: the fatigue of modern life. And still, the ritual persisted, the boiling of water, the waiting, the pause before the first sip. Perhaps that pause, that tiny rebellion against haste, is what has always made drinking special. Each cup, however ordinary, is a moment stolen from the machine, the ghost in the teapot. When we look back across the centuries of British history, the wars, the factories, the empires, we often overlook the most persistent of revolutions, the domestic kind, conducted in porcelain and glass. The teapot on the table outlasted governments. The tonic bottle outlasted empires. Each represented a private form of resilience, a way to endure the demands of an age that never stopped moving. Through tea, temperance, and tonic, the British learned, often painfully, how to manage pleasure without admitting it, how to seek solace without calling it escape. Their empire was built on motion. Their peace depended on the pause, the quiet reflection, and so you sit once more in that same imagined parlor, though the world outside has changed beyond recognition. The lace curtains are gone. The gaslight has been replaced by electric glow. The clock still ticks, but now it hums softly, powered by something unseen. You lift a cup, tea perhaps, or coffee, and for a moment the centuries blur. This act, so small and repetitive, is older than the empire that once made it possible. It is the gesture of every tired worker, every anxious soul, every hopeful morning. The tea may no longer come from distant colonies. The sugar may be fair trade. The tonic may sparkle with artificial quinine. But the need behind it, the longing for calm, for balance, for one moment of control, remains unchanged. And perhaps that is what makes history most human, not the wars or inventions, but the quiet persistence of small rituals that outlive both. The empire has fallen, the factories have dimmed, but the kettle still sings. If you close your eyes and listen carefully, you can almost hear it, the sound that defined an age. It begins as a faint murmur, a gentle clicking, the shuffle of shuttles, and then grows into a steady roar, a heartbeat of wooden frames and iron gears. This is not the music of a single loom, but of thousands, working in unison, echoing through the damp valleys of Lancashire and Yorkshire. It is the sound of transformation, of flax becoming linen, of cotton becoming cloth, of Britain weaving its empire one thread at a time. Yet beneath this rhythmic certainty lies something else, the ledger. For every roll of finished calico, every length of muslin or wool, there is an entry, a number, a name. Someone has counted, measured and priced it. The loom gives shape, the ledger gives meaning. And so, between the threads and the figures, the Industrial Revolution wove its true tapestry. Not merely of cloth, but of labour, capital, and time itself. The birth of the mill, the story begins with water. In the late 18th century, long before the hum of steam, the textile industry was a scattered craft. Spinning and weaving were domestic trades, carried out in cottages where families laboured by firelight. A mother spun flax while her children wound thread. The father wove on a handloom in the next room. But the rivers of northern England carried a different kind of promise. The steady current could turn a wheel, and the wheel could power machinery. Entrepreneurs like Richard Arkwright saw not just water, but motion, and motion meant profit. In 1771, Arkwright opened his first water-powered mill in Cromford, Derbyshire. It was both a building and a new kind of organism. Inside, every worker was a moving part. Every movement was measured in output. The old cottage industry had been transformed into something larger, more precise, and infinitely less personal. By the early 1800s, the landscape of Britain's north was dotted with mills, long, rectangular buildings of red brick and glass, their chimneys rising like monuments to efficiency. The factory had become the cathedral of modern labour. Cotton, the empire's softest weapon, cotton was not native to Britain. It arrived by ship, raw, packed, and silent, from the plantations of America, the Caribbean, and later Egypt and India. Each bale was a small piece of empire, a product of faraway labour and local invention. In Manchester, nicknamed Cottonopolis, raw fibre entered warehouses like a river of fluff. It was cleaned, carded, spun into thread, and woven into fabric by thousands of workers, mostly women and children. The finished cloth was then exported across the world, back to the very colonies that had grown the cotton. Shirts for India, linens for Africa, uniforms for soldiers in far-off stations, all bore the marks of Lancashire's mills. Cotton, light as air and soft to the touch, became the foundation of industrial capitalism. It clothed the empire and financed it too. The life inside the mill. Step inside a textile mill around 1840. The air is thick, not with smoke, but with dust, fibres and the dry heat of machinery. The noise is constant, a deafening thunder that swallows every word. The looms stand in rows, each operated by a weaver who must keep pace with their relentless rhythm. The The workers communicate not by speech, but by glance, gesture, or practiced instinct. Women tie broken threads with nimble fingers. Children dart beneath the machines to gather fallen yarn, their small size making them both useful and vulnerable. Men oversee the machines, oiling gears, hauling bales, noting output. Time is everything. The bell marks the start of the shift, the end of the shift, the meal breaks in between. Hours stretch like threads themselves, long, unbroken, easily frayed. For the first time in history, the worker's day is not ruled by sunlight or season, but by the factory clock. And with that simple shift, human life becomes measurable. The ledgers rule. If the mill is the body of industry, the ledger is its mind. Every spool of thread, every hour of labor, every ounce of waste is recorded. Wages are calculated down to the farthing. Timesheets are kept, checked, and signed. To the clerk in his small glass office, the world outside exists as columns and rows of figures. A worker is a name beside a number, a bale of cotton, a debit beside a credit. This meticulous record-keeping was not mere bureaucracy, it was ideology. It taught that value could be counted, that work could be quantified, that life itself could be managed through arithmetic. And so the mill owner's power was not only mechanical but mathematical. He did not shout commands, he balanced accounts. The ledger spoke softly, but it ruled absolutely. Child labor and the measure of small hands among the earliest to rise at dawn were the children. Some were as young as 6. They worked as scavengers or piecers, crawling under looms to collect thread or mend broken yarn. Their wages were low, a few shillings a week, but their labor kept the machines from stopping. Many had been apprenticed from orphanages or parish houses. To the overseers, they were both cheap and expendable. The first factory acts, passed in the 1830s, attempted to regulate their hours. Inspectors visited mills, measuring not just machines but bodies, the height of a child, the strength of their hands, the rate of their heartbeat after a day's work. It was perhaps the first time the state had tried to quantify compassion. Yet enforcement was weak, and the mills continued to hum. Childhood had become a line item in an industrial ledger, the quiet resistance, and yet, amid the roar, there were moments of stillness, small acts of defiance that never reached the newspapers. A woman who slowed her loom by half a beat to rest her fingers. A boy who hit a broken bobbin rather than admit a mistake. A weaver who sang softly, her voice lost in the din, as though to remind herself she was more than a number. These were not protests, but whispers of endurance. The great strikes and labor movements would come later, led by men with speeches and banners. But inside the mill, resistance often took quieter forms. A missing spool, a moment's pause, a secret glance through the factory window toward a patch of sky. The machines demanded precision. The workers reclaimed small fragments of imperfection. The counting of time before the factory. Time had been irregular, a thing felt rather than measured. Farmers worked with the sun. Craftsmen followed the rhythm of demand. But inside the mill, every moment became identical. The clock did not know weather, season, or fatigue. It ticked evenly, indifferent to everything but motion. The historian E.P. Thompson called this time discipline, the transformation of labor into punctuality. It was, in its own way, a conquest of the human spirit. For once time was counted, it could be bought and sold. A worker no longer offered skill but hours. A life was measured not in years but in shifts. And the ledger recorded it all, faithfully, silently, without judgment. Cottonopolis at night, when the looms finally stopped, and the whistle announced the end of the day. The sound that followed was not silence but ringing. Workers stepped into the evening with the rhythm of the machines still echoing in their bones. The air outside was cool, laced with the smell of coal and wet stone. In Manchester, gas lamps reflected on the canals, their waters carrying both waste and reflection. Shop windows displayed finished fabrics, delicate muslins, crisp linens, glowing softly under lamplight. Few who passed those windows could afford what they made inside the mills. But perhaps that was the truest emblem of the agey beauty produced by exhaustion. In the quiet that followed, a clerk somewhere closed his ledger for the night. His ink dried beside neat rows of numbers, an entire day's worth of motion reduced to order. The mill would start again at dawn, and so the story of the loom is also the story of the ledger, of how human rhythm became mechanical, and how in the pursuit of order, the Victorians learned to weave not only cloth but time itself. But as the century wore on, the balance began to shift. Workers found their voice, laws changed, and even the owners began to question what it meant to run an empire of threads. The question lingered like dust in the air of every factory. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain's textile industry had become a world unto itself, vast, disciplined, and strangely alive. The mills stood like fortresses along river valleys and canals, their tall chimneys breathing clouds that mingled with the sky. Every morning, the same procession unfolded. At the clang of the mill bell, hundreds of men, women, and children filed through the gates. The mill doors closed behind them, sealing them in for 12, sometimes 14 hours of labor. The day had begun, not for a person, but for the machine. In those hours, every human gesture was part of a larger pattern. Every movement, every heartbeat, contributed to the ceaseless rhythm of production. It was a new kind of existence, one in which the measure of a life was not its story, but its output. And yet, beneath the mathematics of the ledger, there remained something irreducible, the persistence of the human thread. The art of the ledger. To understand Victorian industry, one must understand its devotion to measurement. The ledgers of the time were not mere bookkeeping tools, they were philosophical documents, repositories of faith in numbers, evidence that the world could be managed, tamed, and balanced. In the office above the mill floor, clerks in starched collars bent over wide pages of ruled paper. Their pens scratched steadily, translating noise and motion into the silent order of ink. Output per spindle, yarn lost to breakage, wedges dispersed in coin. Everything that moved was measured, and everything measured was compared. Efficiency was the new morality. It promised fairness, progress, and mastery. But in its pursuit, the people themselves became variables, predictable, replaceable, and, ultimately, invisible. The factory, in this sense, was a moral experiment. Could order produce virtue? Could discipline create prosperity? For a time it seemed so. The ledgers balanced beautifully. The mill towns outside the mills, entire towns had grown up like appendages. Rows of identical brick houses stretched in straight lines from the factory gates, each with its narrow garden and its coal smoke drifting upward. The rhythm of life in these towns was synchronized with the rhythm of production. Wages were paid on Saturday, shopping done on Saturday night, washing on Monday, church on Sunday. The air always carried a faint scent of oil and dust, a reminder that labor never truly ended. Even the rivers, once clear, ran brown and foamy with waste. In winter, the mist thickened, the sky turned the color of iron, and the sound of the mill bell echoed across frozen fields like a sermon. Yet in the smallness of their world, mill workers built lives of quiet endurance, communities bound not by wealth but by routine. They knew each other's footsteps, each other's songs, each other's silences. Women at the loom. Though the mill owners were men, the mills themselves were largely feminine. By 1850, women made up more than half the textile workforce. They were spinners, weavers, reelers, their hands deft, their eyes sharp, their bodies trained to the tempo of machines. For many, mill work was both necessity and freedom. It provided wages, modest, but their own, and a space outside the domestic sphere. A girl could earn money, dress respectably, and walk to work with friends rather than remain confined to a cottage. Yet independence came at a cost. The mills demanded precision and endurance, punishing those who slowed or faltered. The looms were dangerous. Threads snapped and whirled, gears caught hair or sleeves, and accidents were frequent. A moment's distraction could mean a lifetime of injury. Still, women endured, and their endurance reshaped society. The factory girl, once dismissed as immoral or unladylike, gradually became a symbol of industrious virtue. Newspapers praised her thrift and discipline. Reformers cited her wages as proof that work could uplift. In a world that measured human worth by productivity, she was both model and warning, proof that labor could be feminine, and that respectability could be earned through toil. The overseers between the workers and the owners stood the overseers, men who understood both the rhythm of the machines and the temperament of those who served them. They were not cruel by design, but by necessity. Their success depended on control, and control meant enforcing pace. A loom that fell silent for 10 minutes could ruin the day's totals. A weaver who slowed could throw off an entire row's production. And so they watched, timed, and corrected. They carried ledgers of their own, smaller than the master's, but no less precise. Each entry marked a worker's reliability, their output, their lateness, their infractions. The system rewarded vigilance and punished fatigue. To the overseer, discipline was a form of mercy, a way to preserve order in a world that demanded perfection. But for those below, it was a constant reminder that time no longer belonged to them. The Factory Acts. By the 1830s, the public conscience began to stir. Reports of overwork, child labour, and accidents in the mills reached Parliament. The result was the first of the Factory Acts. Laws intended to regulate the length of the working day, the employment of children, and the safety of machinery. The inspectors sent to enforce these laws found themselves in strange territory. They walked among roaring machines, taking notes on clipboards, measuring children's height with brass rods to ensure compliance. They recorded accidents, hours, and wages, creating, ironically, another layer of ledgers above the ledgers. Each act was a compromise between reform and industry. The working day shortened from 16 hours to 12, then 10. Ventilation was improved, guards were added to machines, and child labor gradually declined. But the mills continued to run. The noise, the dust, the rhythm all remained. Progress, like the machines themselves, came in increments. The account of accidents hidden in many surviving factory records are curious entries, dry lines of text that hint at quiet tragedies. Broken spindle, repair ordered, worker no 73, minor injury to hand, delay half hour, cause power failure. These are not stories, only fragments. Yet between the lines lies an entire world of unspoken loss. Injury was not uncommon, it was expected. Each broken bone, each missing finger, each cough that deepened into silence was absorbed into the arithmetic of production. Compensation, when given, was small. A few shillings, a brief note in the ledger. And still the work continued. Because the machine did not know pity, the loom only knew motion, and motion was profit. The industrial Sabbath for those who lived by the mill clock, Sunday was more than a religious observance. It was a rare stillness. On Sunday mornings, the town seemed almost eerily quiet. The air, usually thick with cotton dust, felt clean. The sound of church bells replaced the hum of looms. Men polished their boots, women brushed lint from their shawls. Families walked to church along cobbled streets, their faces pale from indoor life. Sermons often echoed the logic of the factory discipline, duty and thrift. God's order, like the mills, was to be obeyed. Yet after service, there were moments of gentle rebellion. Walks in the countryside, laughter by the river, a slow meal shared without haste. It was on those quiet Sundays that many realized how loud their lives had become. The quiet calculations of reform by the 1860s. Some mill owners began to speak of moral management. They built schools for workers' children, offered reading rooms, and sponsored church outings. These gestures, though paternalistic, marked a shift. The industrialist no longer saw himself as merely a producer of goods, but as a steward of souls. Factories became laboratories of social order. Cleanliness, punctuality, and sobriety were encouraged as virtues that sustained both profit and morality. The factory clock was not just a tool, it was a sermon in steel. But others, like the reformer Robert Owen, imagined something gentler, communities where work and welfare could coexist. He dreamed of mills where education softened the noise, and fairness replaced fear. His experiment at New Lanark inspired thousands, though few replicated it. The question persisted: could a mill be both productive and humane? The answer, like the echo of the looms, remained uncertain. The value of a human hour. By the final decades of the century, labor unions had begun to take root. Workers demanded not only wages, but dignity. The phrase, "fair day's pay for a fair day's work," entered public consciousness. It was at its core a mathematical plea, an attempt to balance human worth against industrial output. Yet even as conditions improved, the essential tension remained: how to assign value to time. A factory could measure production precisely, yards of cloth, pounds of cotton, hours on the clock. But what of fatigue, of imagination, of the simple will to endure? Those remained uncounted. In every ledger, there was a margin, a quiet space where the arithmetic of the human soul refused to fit. The mills of the late Victorian era would grow quieter in time, their windows broken, their chimneys cold, but the logic they invented, of measurement, of efficiency, of human life translated into numbers, would never fade. Even now, we live by their rhythm timesheets, quotas, deadlines, statistics. The question lingers, patient as the hum of the old looms. It is the 1890s. The great mills of Lancashire and Yorkshire still stand, their brick walls unshaken, their chimneys still breathing, but something invisible has begun to shift. The empire is at its height. British cloth covers half the world. Yet at home, the rhythm of the looms has slowed. The roar of progress, once constant, now falters in odd intervals. For the first time in over a century, silence is creeping into the ledger. The story of the textile mills, like all stories of industry, does not end with collapse or victory, but with a slow unraveling. The loosening of a thread that once held an empire together. The wariness of prosperity. By the turn of the century, the workers of the northern mills had earned some measure of stability. Wages were modest but regular, hours were shorter, safety had improved. Many owned small homes near the factory gates, their window-sill geraniums bright against the soot-darkened bricks. Children went to school, Sunday outings to the countryside became common, and yet a certain fatigue settled over these towns. A sense that the ceaseless motion of the looms had woven itself into the body too deeply to be undone. Men who had worked in the mills since childhood found themselves deafened by their own industry. Women's fingers, once nimble, stiffened with age. The younger generation began to look elsewhere. To offices, to the railways, to cities where the air was clearer and the rhythm different. The mills were no longer the only future. They were becoming, slowly and quietly, the past. The decline of Cottonopolis, Manchester, once the heart of global textile production, began to change its pulse. The city skyline, still dominated by mill chimneys, was now punctuated by new forms of ambition, banks, warehouses, and office towers of pale stone. Cotton was still the foundation, but commerce had grown into abstraction. The product mattered less than the profit. The mills of India and Egypt, once suppliers of raw cotton, had begun to weave their own cloth. British merchants, once masters of every link in the chain, found competition rising from the very territories they had industrialized. The empire had learned its own lessons too well. Even as exports declined, production in the north continued, driven by habit and pride. The mills ran on inertia, the momentum of a century. In the ledgers, profits shrank, but the ink still flowed. The mill as memory for those who remained. The factory had become something more than a workplace. It was a living memory, a place that held the weight of generations. Grandfathers had built it, mothers had spun there, sons and daughters had met and married under its clock tower. The walls, stained with oil, told a story of endurance and routine. To leave the mill was to step outside of time itself, into a world that moved differently, unpredictably. And so many stayed, even as the work thinned. They came not just for wages, but for rhythm, the comfort of knowing what each hour would bring. In a century defined by acceleration, the mill offered something paradoxically stable: repetition. The empty ledger in the 1890s and early 1900s, something remarkable happened in many of the mill offices of Lancashire. The ledgers began to contain more white space. Where once every line had been filled with figures, production totals, attendance records, wages, now there were gaps, cancellations, weeks without entry. The clerks noticed before the workers did. They saw it in the numbers, the subtle decline of output, the increase in idle hours, the diminishing of profits. The language of loss was not dramatic, it was numerical. It appeared as subtraction. For those who had built their faith on precision, the empty columns were unsettling, a quiet reminder that even numbers could not guarantee permanence. The slow death of noise, when a mill closed, it did not happen all at once. There was no final bell, no ceremony. A loom broke and was not repaired. A weaver left and was not replaced. Weeks stretched between shipments. The great engines slowed, and then one morning, they simply did not start. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. For workers who had spent decades surrounded by sound, the absence of it was disorienting. Some said they could still hear the echo in their sleep. The ghostly clatter of looms, the whistle of the morning bell. Others stood in the empty rooms, looking at the dust drifting through shafts of light, and realized how deeply the rhythm of the mill had been woven into their own breathing. The machines had not just shaped cloth, they had shaped consciousness. The workers' voices, it was in this twilight of industry that new forms of storytelling began to appear. Former mill workers, many now elderly or unemployed, wrote memoirs, letters, and local histories. They spoke of comradeship, hardship, and pride. They remembered the songs sung under the roar of machinery, the ones no overseer could silence. In their words, one hears not bitterness but melancholy, the sorrow of those who have lost something familiar, even if it was harsh. One woman from Oldham wrote, "When the mill stopped, it felt like winter. I missed the sound. I missed the steam. I missed being tired at the end of the day." The mills had given her exhaustion, but also purpose. Without them, time lost its shape. The Museum of Motion by the early 20th century, some mills were converted into warehouses, others into schools or housing. A few were preserved as museums. Visitors came to marvel at the machinery, the spindles, the shuttles, the belts, and at the courage of those who had once tended them. Guides explained how each process worked: the carding, the spinning, the weaving. They demonstrated how much noise a single loom could make. Children pressed their fingers over their ears and stared, wide-eyed, at the blur of motion. And yet, for those who remembered, there was something eerie about watching history perform itself. The machines still moved, but they no longer worked. The rhythm remained, But the meaning was gone. The museum preserved the body of industry, but not its soul. The legacy of the ledger, even as the mills faded, their logic survived. The precision of accounting, the measurement of time, the pursuit of efficiency, these had escaped the factory and entered the modern world. Offices now kept time sheets, schools had bells, trains ran to schedules. The discipline of the loom had become the discipline of the nation. What had begun as industrial necessity became moral expectation, punctuality, productivity, thrift. The ledger, once confined to the mill office, now ruled everywhere. And so, even as the last looms fell silent, the Victorian factory continued to hum, invisibly, in the structure of daily life. The threads that remain, if you walk through Manchester today, you can still trace the outlines of that vanished world. The canals still glisten, though they carry more reflections than goods. The old mill buildings stand repurposed, their brick walls polished, their windows gleaming as offices or apartments. But look closely, and you will see it. Faint grooves worn into the stone by the footsteps of workers, iron rings in the walls where belts once turned. The city still breathes with the rhythm of the 19th century, not in noise, but in memory. For every office worker checking the time, every commuter rushing for a train, every ledger balanced at day's end, carries within them the echo of the loom. The industrial age did not end. It simply changed its sound. The reflection in the end, the story of the mills, is neither triumph nor tragedy. It is a meditation on endurance, on the human ability to turn repetition into meaning and toil into rhythm. The weavers and spinners of Victorian England may not have known they were part of a revolution, but they felt its weight in their bones. They gave the modern world its habits, its clocks, its schedules, its belief that time is a thing to be managed rather than lived. And perhaps somewhere deep within us, that belief still hums, quiet, constant, unexamined. The looms may have stopped, but the counting never did. The Victorian household was an empire in miniature, a structure of power and appearance, ruled not by armies or parliaments but by manners, rituals, and a precise choreography of daily life. It is easy to imagine the stately homes of the 19th century as peaceful refuges of refinement, shining silver, ticking clocks, the scent of polished wood and wax. But beneath the quiet surface, entire lives unfolded in secrecy and repetition. For every drawing room conversation there were footsteps in corridors. For every elegant supper there was sweat, steam, and exhaustion in the kitchen below. If the mistress of the house was its face, then the servants were its unseen hands, forever moving, forever controlled. This is the story of those hands. The architecture of hierarchy, the design of a Victorian home, revealed its philosophy. From the outside, great houses presented symmetry and grace, white columns, bay windows, ivy creeping up the brick. But step through the servants' entrance, and the illusion changed. Beneath the floors of elegance lay a network of passages, stairwells, and narrow corridors. Bells lined the walls, each marked with the name of a room: morning room, study, nursery, dining room. When one rang, the vibration traveled down copper wires to the servants' hall, where the sound was both command and alarm. It did not matter who had pressed the button upstairs. To the servant, every bell was the same, a summons without a voice, a signal that erased individuality. In many homes, servants were not allowed to use the main staircase or be seen by guests. They existed in the margins of architecture, between walls, behind doors, beneath ceilings, their presence measured by absence. The house was not only a home, it was a machine, and its servants the cogs that kept it running. The rise before dawn, the day began before sunrise. At 4:30 in the morning, the first sound was often the rattle of coal buckets and the hiss of the kitchen range coming to life. The scullery maid, usually the youngest and lowest in rank, began her work in near darkness. She scrubbed pots from the night before, polished boots, and blacked the grates. Her hands were raw by dawn, her apron stiff with soot. By 5 the housemaid joined her, dusting and sweeping every room before the family stirred. The trick was to erase all signs of the night's disorder before anyone saw them. At 6 the butler and housekeeper arrived to inspect, not to assist, but to ensure perfection. Breakfast for the servants followed, though even that was divided by rank, the cook and butler at the head of the table, the maids and footmen below, and the scullery girl often standing to eat. Hierarchy existed even in hunger. The master's breakfast, when the family rose, the pace quickened. The cook prepared eggs, kippers, or cold meats. The parlour maid arranged the tablecloth. The butler tested the silver for blemishes. Every plate, every napkin, every cup had a place and purpose. Upstairs, the lady's maid laced her mistress into her corset, tightened until breath was shallow but posture perfect. She brushed her hair precisely 100 strokes, scented her gloves, and folded her letters. All of this was to prepare for the brief, public performance of breakfast. The first ritual of the day, where nothing was spontaneous and everything suggested control. Downstairs, no one ate again until late afternoon. The rules of silence, the servants' most valued trait, was discretion. Not only were they forbidden from speaking unnecessarily, but they were expected to erase emotion altogether. The ideal servant moved silently, anticipated needs without being told, and left no trace of having been there. They were to see everything, yet acknowledge nothing. There were stories, whispered, never written, of servants dismissed for the smallest infractions, a cough during tea, a glance in a mirror, laughter in the hall. In one household, a maid was fired for leaving a handprint on a polished door. The punishment was not only dismissal but exile. A servant's reputation was her livelihood. One misstep could end her career entirely. So the training was strict, hands folded, eyes down, voice quiet. To serve was to vanish gracefully. The invisible economy servants were not merely part of the household. They were its economic foundation. In 1851, the National Census of England recorded over 1 million domestic servants, making service the single largest occupation in the country. Even families of modest means often employed at least one maid of all work, a woman responsible for cooking, cleaning, and childcare in exchange for wages barely enough to live on. For upper-class homes, the staff could number in the dozens: cooks, scullery maids, footmen, gardeners, laundresses, governesses, coachmen, and grooms. Each role had its own rituals and rank, a world within a world governed by invisible rules. And yet, despite their indispensability, servants had few rights. Wages could be withheld for mistakes, letters could be opened by the housekeeper, privacy was nearly non-existent. Their only security was obedience. The housekeeper's book, at the heart of every great home, was the housekeeper's room, a small but orderly space where the day's true work was recorded. Here, ledgers listed every expense. Candles used, coal consumed, sugar purchased, soap requested. Nothing escaped the account. The housekeeper herself was both administrator and enforcer, stern, loyal, and meticulous. She controlled the keys, rationed the tea, and kept the staff in line. Her tone was measured, her authority unquestioned. For the women who served beneath her, she was both protector and oppressor, a reminder that hierarchy existed even among those who shared the same servitude. Some servants adored her. Others feared her more than the master himself. The private rebellions, and yet, even in such tightly bound systems, rebellion found small cracks through which to grow. A footman might pocket a spoonful of wine from a bottle before serving it. A maid might read the mistress's letters in secret, learning of loves and scandals. The cook might substitute cheaper butter for imported French and keep the difference. None of these acts changed the world, but they restored, in fleeting moments, a sense of agency. More dangerous still were the silent friendships between servants of rival households. The exchange of gossip, the whispered comparison of wages, the shared wish for something beyond service. Such acts were invisible to the masters, but they sustained the servant's sense of self. For beneath the obedience and repetition, there lingered a quiet truth: the servants knew everything. The weight of observation: to serve was to watch. The maid who dusted the bookshelves knew what volumes her employer favored, whether poetry or politics. The valet who pressed a gentleman's coat knew the shape of his shoulders better than his wife did. The nursemaid overheard every word of every bedtime story and argument alike. The servants' hall held more knowledge of the family's private life than any diary, and yet they carried it all in silence. It was said that the best servant was one who might as well be deaf and dumb. But they were neither. They heard and saw everything. They simply had nowhere to speak it. That silence, over years, became its own burden, a pressure that lived behind the eyes, a knowledge that could not be released. A clock without a face. The Victorian household prided itself on order. Breakfast at 8, luncheon at 1, dinner at 7, prayers at 10. But the true rhythm of the house was kept not by the family, but by the servants. It was they who wound the clocks, lit the lamps, and rang the bells. They marked the hours not for themselves, but for others. And yet, despite their mastery of time, they were not allowed to claim it. The servants' time belonged wholly to the household, a strange, borrowed existence in which every minute was owed to someone else. They lived, as one writer described, in the space between hours. Each day began and ended with the same ritual motions: the strike of a match, the sweep of a broom, the folding of linen. It was a life without climax or recognition, and yet in its endurance there was a kind of quiet